Hi. So, as previously mentioned, I'd done that review of the 2010s decade. Now I want to look at what may lie ahead. This is very, very generic. It's certainly not intended to be comprehensive. And to be honest, I haven't even planned this video. It's pretty spontaneous. Just some things off the top of my head. And this is about the world, society, geopolitics, culture, and so on. Not so much about myself. I may make another video about that, about what direction I want to bring this channel and so on. Okay, so we are now 1/5 of the way through the century. We have 10 years ahead of the 20s, a little less than 10 years now. Um, and each decade is sort of defined by particular movements or particular trends in society. Um, I think some of the things that we've seen from the last decade will continue. I'll come to those in a minute, but there are certain things that are with almost certainty sealed in time. That is to say that there are certain things we know are going to happen, with the possible exception, the only thing that would stop them is a world war. What I'm talking about, for example, is the Olympic Games. Um, when you have cyclical sort of events like the Olympics or like the American presidential race or the French presidential race, here in Britain, we're a bit more general elections, as we know, are more spontaneous. But we know that those are cyclical events, so we can be absolutely sure that the United States of America will have a presidential election this November. We can be absolutely sure that the United States of America will have a presidential election in November 2024 and in November 2028. We know with almost 100% certainty that the Tokyo Summer Olympics will take place this year, and then Paris in 2024 and Los Angeles in 2028. In fact, the IOC done something which I wasn't very fussed on at the time, which is they named two cities in advance. Usually, the way it works is there is the bidding process, and that event, it's quite a big event in itself. Even the host city for the naming ceremony is an event in itself. That's usually 7 years before an Olympic Games, but the last time around, for some reason, they done it have two Olympics named in advance, which means Los Angeles had well, a long time to prepare. So no excuses if it goes wrong. Yeah, so those are things that we know for certain are going to happen. There will be certain other scheduled events that are very likely to happen and anniversaries that will absolutely happen. For example, if Queen Elizabeth II is still on the throne in 2022, which is plausible because she's in relatively reasonable health, she will become the first British monarch to see a platinum jubilee. And that is something that we can quantify. We know that unless she passes away before that, that's certain. Um, but she is 93 now, and she is making fewer public engagements, so it's not 100% certain. There's other things we know, for example, anniversaries. There will be numerous anniversaries throughout the decade, but I want to talk about things that could happen, things that could develop. Let me break this down a little bit into different sort of categories. So let's look at armed conflict, right? As it stands, there are some bloody wars going on in the world today. In Syria, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, the Boko Haram insurgency certainly hasn't de-escalated. So these are all conflicts that are still going on, and there's others, but those are some of the big ones. The situation in Syria, I predict that civil war may finally sort of phase out. I don't think there will necessarily be a concrete ceasefire, as for example the ones that ended the Vietnam War or the Bosnian War, but I think it might gradually phase out. And I think it might be that Assad forces will get the upper hand. They have had the military advantage for most of this war. As I understand it, there's a final push going on in Idlib province, and that will be kind of mixed. On one hand, it will mean that a blood-stained dictator who's been responsible for many, many thousands of civilian deaths, will be in power still and will never face justice for his crimes against humanity. On the other hand, the end of war in Syria can only be a good thing in and of itself, because this is a country that's going to take not years, probably decades to rebuild, such as the damage that's been done there. So it's a great tragedy, I would say, of the 2010s is the Syria war. There's others, of course, but that one particularly stands out. Incidentally, in my last video, I mentioned the one thing I negated to mention was global terrorism. Terrorism's been around in some form or another always, but I would say it really started to become newsworthy in about the 1970s onwards, when there was hijackings related to both the Colombian conflict and Middle East conflict. And then we saw the spread of Islamist terrorism, particularly from 9/11 onwards, but didn't begin with 9/11. Um, so throughout the 2010s, we saw the spread of pan-Islamism in the form of Islamic State and other vicious groups like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram, but particularly Islamic State. And interestingly enough, the decline of Al-Qaeda following the death of bin Laden. But I think this is going to be a very, very drawn out thing. I have absolutely no optimism that Islamic terrorism will end in this decade. And by the way, when I say Islamic terrorism, no, I'm not calling all Muslims terrorists. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there is Islamic extremism, and that's manifested itself in the sort of attacks that we've seen worldwide in Paris and Sri Lanka, in Orlando and elsewhere, not to mention scores of atrocities in the Middle East and West Africa. So I think that isn't going to end anytime soon. The death of Baghdadi was a blow to ISIS, but I certainly don't think it's the end. Even if their actual territory is regained by Syrian forces or other governments, that would actually mean that they then have more attention to focus on being an insurgency movement, a terrorist movement. So unfortunately, there's no sign of this ending anytime soon. Sadly, there will be other atrocities throughout the next decade. It's kind of a long, drawn out war that we are in with this ideology, and there's no easy answers to it. I think the world's going to continue to see refugee situations. Um, the situation in the Mediterranean has definitely declined from its sort of peak levels in 2015, 2016. But I don't think that it's going to suddenly stop. There will still be desperate people doing desperate things to get to Europe. Then we look at situations in Southeast Asia with the Rohingya people. So there's a lot of things that when the 31st of December didn't see a sudden end of these things. The concentration camps in Xinjiang are still there. So there's a whole host of problems this world is facing that I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. But like I say, no period is all good or all bad, and there is some signs of optimism. One of those places where there is signs of optimism is a country that has long been plagued by dictatorship and war, and that's Sudan. Sudan is arguably one of the success stories of the decade in the sense that this was a people-led revolution that overthrew a long-standing dictator, not without cost. There was bloodshed in the revolution. But it looks like Sudan is genuinely on the way up. This has to be welcomed, and the international community, liberal democratic societies need to be supporting the Sudanese people at this time, not by any sort of military intervention, but by supporting their push for the democratization of Sudan. This proves that it can be done. The fact that it's a women-led revolution, the fact that Islamist laws have now been discarded, those are all good signs. Um, so there's ground for optimism. The Ethiopia-Eritrea conflict, one of the world's longest running and most bitter conflicts, finally came to an end. That's to be welcomed. The Colombian armed conflict, there are low-level insurgencies still going on in the country, but it is definitely on a better trajectory. So it's not all bad news when we think of armed conflicts, but I do think that as natural resources become an issue, um, partly because of climate change, this could feed fuel war. We may see an increase in border conflicts, particularly on the African continent. I predict there will be border conflicts. I'm not going to name any specific countries, but potentially over natural amenities. I think we may see a continuation of people power type movements, social unrest. Those things are going to continue, and the outcome really depends on how they're manifested and what sort of support the opposing parties have. So I think a lot of the things that we saw in the 2010s are going to continue in this decade. Um, yeah, but that's very the speculation. If we look at a country like Afghanistan, it's very difficult to see it ever being in peace. It's a country that's been plagued by war now for 41 years. The Saur Revolution, 41, 42 years. So it's very difficult to be optimistic about a country like Afghanistan. But um, and if we look at the ancient world, there were conflicts that lasted in some cases for centuries. If we look at ancient China, for example, so one can be forgiven for thinking that some lands are just cursed. Having said that, I think that, who would have thought 20 years ago that Sudan was on a better trajectory? This was a country that was dirt poor, that was run by a brutal dictator, and that saw millions killed in civil war. And yet now Sudan is on an upward trajectory. So it's not absolutely implausible. Um, Brexit is supposedly going to happen at the end of this week. It probably will. But I don't think we're going to see any immediate changes in this country. It's going to be an 11-month transitionary period. 10 years from now, I hope it is a kind of, we've long moved on from it. That's my hope. I do hope the UK will get more political stability in this 10 years. Although, if Scotland decides, or rather, if the Scottish Nationals try to push for another referendum, which they almost certainly will, there's clearly going to be some constitutional headaches for the United Kingdom. So that's not something to look forward to. Um, we are definitely seeing around the world a younger population, particularly in developing countries, in a country like Uganda and many Arab states. They're very young populations. I think that's going to have a huge influence in terms of how those countries go forward. And potentially that could be a good thing. But population is controversial as it is to talk about it. That could also be an important issue that will be increasingly one that needs to be addressed, particularly when some African countries are scheduled to really rocket in population. Uganda, for example, I believe has about 40 million people at present, thereabouts, pushing that figure anyway. In the next 20, 30 years is going to be pushing up to 70 million, 100 million. It's just going to keep going up. India is likely going to surpass China in the next 10 years as the world's most populous country. That could lead to serious tensions within Indian society. We're already seeing this over the controversial citizenship bill. So it could be that India's superpower ambitions is greatly tested in the next 10 years. India isn't quite at superpower level yet, but it is a great power, and I think that's going to be one to watch. China, Hong Kong has definitely been a test for the Chinese leadership, and it's not entirely out of the woods yet. So, if Xi Jinping continues a hardline stance, particularly with Xinjiang, it may well be that Islamists do revert their focus from the West to China. Um, so without question, there's going to be events happening in China in the next 10 years. It's hard to say what. I do not see a revolution in China itself, a people led revolution, because most Chinese are relatively content enough. And most Chinese don't think about issues like human rights. They just want bread and butter issues, understandably so. So I don't think there's any immediate chance of a revolution happening in China. It goes without saying, if that was to happen, that would be world changing. That would be the defining event of the decade. It's one thing to have a revolution in a country like Sudan or Yemen or even Egypt, but China, that would be something else. But definitely, there's going to be things happening in Chinese society in the next 10 years that will be, and a lot will depend on how the Communist Party responds to that. Russia's going to continue exerting its dominance, but Putin isn't going to be around forever. He said himself that he doesn't want to die in office. This is a reference to Andropov and Chernenko and Brezhnev. Putin's 67 now. So it's conceivable, as hard as it is to believe right now, that Putin may actually have left office by the end of the decade. At the end of this decade, Putin will be 77, and I actually think, notwithstanding the immense personal power that he has, I actually think he might mean that. He might actually want to leave before he becomes a senile old man. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. It'll be interesting to see who succeeds Putin. The American political situation, a lot, of course, depends on whether or not Trump wins re-election. Um, as we saw from the Brexit and Trump situations, pollsters can be dead wrong. So I think it's a foolhardy thing to say that Trump will definitely win or definitely lose. I think at this point we just don't know. A lot depends on who the Democratic nominee is. If President Biden comes into power, for example, he has said he would only serve one term, or he's indicated that. So we could actually see three American presidents in this decade, potentially. And even if Trump gets re-elected, Trump will be in his late 70s when he leaves office. There's a lot of questions around that. Um, I mean, a little bit older than Ronald Reagan was. In terms of popular culture, definitely I can see a backlash against, for example, let's say popular culture and technology. I can see already a backlash against social media giants like Facebook. So I think they may need to radically change some of their culture internally. Excuse me. Can't say off the top of my head any specific examples of this, but I do think that we may see a pushback against the power of social media. There may be a growing awareness of increasing reliance on technology, even more so than the last 20 years. People are going to become aware that actually we are relying on technology a lot more. And is this a good thing or not? And we may even see, I predict we might even see a movement for getting back to basics, getting back to, I'm not talking about going and living in caves and eating grass, but maybe there may be some sort of social movement that kind of questions how much we're relying on technology, even artificial intelligence and things like that. If anyone's seen the series Humans, starring Gemma Chan, there may be a situation like that in the near future where people start to get actually quite uncomfortable about the power of technology. Um, in terms of global health, there will be, like I say, there'll be focus, I think, on population issues, but also this current virus that's going on, the Wuhan coronavirus. Be interesting to see if that leads to any sort of changes in the World Health Organization or how they go about things. As it stands, it hasn't yet been named a pandemic. Um, could we see what I hope doesn't happen? I hope Ricky Gervais was wrong. I hope we don't see a decline in cinema. I like the cinema. I may not like the identity politics of Hollywood, but I like cinema. I like the feeling of cinema. So I hope we don't see a decline in that. One of the major issues of the decade, unquestionably, is going to be climate change. It's also going to be issues around conservation. And I've been looking at paleontology and geology of late. It's been speculated for a while now that we are actually now in a new geological era, out of the Holocene and into the Anthropocene, which is defined as the period when human beings first changed Earth's geology irrevocably through. This could be defined in different ways, either from the start of the Industrial Revolution or the start of the nuclear age in the 1940s. Um, but it may be that there's increasing attention on that. Um, in a few years, we'll hit 8 billion. By the end of the decade, the world population will be about 8.4, 8.5 billion people as the trend is going. So, a little bit more actually. Um, so, a lot of this is speculation. I think there will definitely be an increase or a continuation of the culture wars, unfortunately, left and right, but also issues around transgender issues, feminism, white identity, black identity. All these things are going to rumble on in the Western world. Um, a lot of things happened in the last decade. You can be forgiven for thinking, well, what more can happen? I mean, we saw the world's largest women's march. We saw some huge events take place worldwide, and one can't think can it actually get any bigger than that short of a world war. As for a world war, I'm actually cautiously optimistic because I feel like every time there's an international incident, there's this speculation, oh, it's World War Three, or if you want to be a purist about it, World War Five or Six, depending on how you classify a world war. You know, some would say the Seven Years' War was the first world war, but anyway, that's for another video. Um, it is definitely conceivable that there will be significant geopolitical tensions. For example, could China try to retake Taiwan? I think the South China Sea is going to continue to be a major question mark. I think that the Hanoi and Singapore summits unfortunately failed, so North Korea may continue testing the boundaries. So I don't think we have the optimism that we had in the early 1990s where the Cold War was over. I think we are in a dangerous, fragile situation. Actually, more people were being killed by armed conflict in the past, but I forget what the body's called. I think it's the World Council of Atomic Science or something like that. They now say that we are 100 seconds from midnight. And this metaphorical clock, it's the closest it has ever been to doomsday, to outright destruction. Now, that should be a wake up call. This planet faces some really serious problems right now, and it doesn't mean that the whole situation is bad. More people are living in democracy than ever before. Information is spread in a better way than ever before. Yet that is coupled by dictators only getting worse and some flashpoints around the world that could also really explode. So I just hope that the things that are improving continue in an upward trajectory. I hope for my country that there's more political stability, and I hope that some of the world's long-standing problems can be resolved. I'm an optimist, but I am also a realist. I'm afraid I simply don't believe that there will ever be total world peace. It's a lovely idea, but unfortunately, I think human beings as a species, there will always be conflict of some kind or another, unfortunately. But I think the focus should be on reducing it um, as much as possible. Let me know your thoughts. What do you think is going to happen in the next 10 years? Okay, I know a lot of this video has been about politics and conflict. I haven't spoken much about culture, music, that sort of thing, because I don't really have strong opinions on it, other than there is changes in the industry, like the rise of Netflix. And with music, I think I define the 2010s, and I'm no expert, but as kind of a mixture of previous decades, kind of all morphed together. It's difficult to really pinpoint what how the 2010s can be defined music-wise. Maybe some of my musical viewers can share their thoughts on that. Vehicles, even vehicle design, stuff like that will be interesting to see what direction we go in. Okay, thanks for watching and let me know your thoughts. What way is the world going to move? One last thing, I'll say this really quickly. I think there will be a change in the news, particularly news outlets. I think the whole fake news thing and Trump versus the media has definitely been a factor in that, as well as changes in the industry. The print press increasingly going to online formats. That's why by the end of the decade, this, the old fashioned print newspaper, could be archaic. That's why I don't feel like it's a waste of my time to collect these. I'm collecting history. Okay, let me know your thoughts.